Hey, everybody. This is yet another episode of Sasquatchers. As always, this is Andrew and John, and tonight we are being joined by Dr. Rita Louise. She is a gifted empath, and before I completely butcher trying to read all of her accolades, I'm just going to go ahead and let her finish the introduction and tell us a little bit about herself and what she does.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me on the show. I really appreciate the invite and bringing value to you and your listeners. So, my story is that when I was young, I wanted to become psychic. There were TV shows, The Amazing Kreskin, who's still doing it, and a different show called The Sixth Sense, where they had ESP, and I wanted to have ESP. And I spent a lot of years reading books on like the chakras and astrology and numerology, and I knew I had some kind of gift but never really owned it. And then I went to the Berkeley Psychic Institute and studied with them, and after being in their program for 3 weeks, I came to the realization that I had been very psychic my whole life, but no one ever connected the dots for me. So once I finished studying with them, I started a private practice. I was Rita the Psychic Chick, where I would talk to you about anything. Ended up going back to school and getting a degree as a naturopath, which is a holistic physician, and then a PhD in natural health counseling. And so that's my day job. And then there's the stuff that I do because it's fun, going ghost hunting, even though I'm afraid of ghosts, but not afraid of ghosts, afraid of the dark. Um, Writing books on ancient mysteries and ancient aliens and relationship stuff, whatever really is floating my boat in that moment that I want to research, I research. And so people are like, God, you talk about all kinds of different things. And it's like, well, I talk about things that interest me. You can only read about chakras and you can only read about certain things for so long before you've kind of read everything there is, or there's really not a very different opinion being made by anyone, because you're at PhD level and, you find these books and they're beginner. And it's like, well, why read it? So I move on to a new topic.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. When I was doing show prep for this episode, I almost became overwhelmed with just how much was covered with your umbrella as far as the areas that you talked about and seemed to be quite an informed expert in. So I was almost nervous about what how do I pick this topic or how do I pick that topic. So I'm glad that you brought some of those topics up because we have had past guests on over the last couple of weeks that we've had ghost hunting investigators who have given us some knowledge. And I would really like to get your take on that subject because you're coming at it from a slightly different angle. So we can jump into that. But let's start at the beginning. How did you? I mean, you wanted to be psychic, you said, but what brought you to that conclusion? And how did you reach it?
I was 12, you know. when so it was a,
Fair.
so my original thing was I wanted to be an archaeologist. And then in
Okay.
eighth grade, we had to do a year-long term paper about our career thing, and so there were all like these nurses and teachers, and I wanted to be an archaeologist. And you had to like reach out to schools, to find out what the educational requirement was. And it said, well, you had to have a PhD if you really wanted to do anything. And so that kind of put a nix on that, even though I have a PhD now. Um, and I just became fascinated with, the whole concept of psychic abilities and ESP and that whole thing. And um, I don't know, it stuck.
I see.
That's huge, it's a huge area, from studying the tarot or studying astrology or studying, the more arcane methods of divination to just being able to do a very straight psychic reading. But again, it wasn't until I went to the Berkeley Psychic Institute that I discovered that some of the things that had happened to me that I wrote off as being a coincidence or just a weird anomaly thing happening was actually me being very psychic.
Do
Do
you
you want a
think
story?
because? Oh yeah, absolutely. I was gonna
You know,
say,
so this
do you think?
so this was before I was psychic, and I was in my early 20s, and I worked at Memorex, and they made, see, I totally date myself with some of these stories, and they made 5 1/4 floppy disk drives. So that
Okay, I
really
remember.
dates you.
I vaguely remember those. I was around for
You're
the
probably
tail end
like,
of
yeah, I
those.
see you in a museum somewhere. And so I worked as a drafter designer person, and in the room next to me was a lab. And so there was a guy who was about my age, and we were kind of hellions because we were the only young people there. And and so his manager, so I would go in there, say hi, torment them for a while, but I really didn't interact with the manager. And I have to put a caveat on this because I tell this story from a 20-year-old's perspective. And so one day the manager wasn't there, which, whatever. And then the following day, he was there, and I walk into the lab, and, I went to go say hi, and he had like this heavy comb over thing happening, and he had a little round band aid on the top of his head. So people that know me better know that I have kind of like a weird, distorted visual mind. And so I'm thinking, he had a zit up there and it turned pussy and it was just kind of nasty. So he put the band aid up there because it was better than having this big red pussy thing. That's what I thought. And I walked up to him. I crossed my arms. I looked at him in the face and said, "Well, where were you yesterday? Having them check for a brain tumor?" And his face turned white and he walked out of the room. And sure enough, that's where he was the day before, was having them check for a brain tumor.
Wow.
But I
Okay.
never correlated like that was a psychic thing.
Yeah. No, that would. Would did he ever like ask how you came to that conclusion so quickly, or?
So the friend of mine, his lab assistant, came screaming at me, screaming. He goes, he thinks I told. So apparently the lab assistant knew. And the
Uh,
manager thought the lab assistant, my friend, told me. And that's how I found out. But no, it just went whoop out of my mouth.
wow.
Oopsie. Oopsie.
Do you think your desire to become psychic at such a young age was maybe a representation of those abilities kind of maybe speaking out to you, and you just had to harness it and didn't quite realize it by that point? Or do you think it was strictly an ability that you obtained through your desire to have it?
Well, I think that the ability was always there. Excuse me. I think that the ability was always there. And I don't know. That's a really interesting question. I've never really looked at it from that perspective. Um, but I spent years studying before I found the Berkeley Psychic Institute and studied with them. And I didn't really feel like I was any more psychic. I teach classes on psychic development in the Institute of Applied Energetics. And one of the things that I share with my students is my job isn't to teach you how to be psychic, because you have a gift. Being psychic is like dancing. You can either dance really good or maybe not so much, or you can do artwork really good or maybe not so much. And you can take classes and maybe get better, or become proficient, but it's still kind of based on your own personal skill set. But what I can do is create situations so that you can recognize your own psychicness. Did that make
Just
sense?
yeah, no, that makes sense. I might have looked confused because I was trying to almost you know identify that kind of within myself for a second. I always try to put myself into the other side of this conversation, and yeah, sometimes it's been easier with some of the other guests. I have like a deep seated interest in this, but it almost it's a subject that's large and can sometimes be vague. So I picked up a book a couple of weeks ago, and it wasn't even anything other than I thought that the cover looked interesting. So I picked it up, and I haven't gotten into it yet. But it's about birthing and understanding one's psychic abilities. So the way that you worded that interested me because I'm a terrible dancer, and I'm okay at art. I did this logo right here, but I don't
Mhm.
think I'm particularly talented in that regard either. So when you said that, I was just kind of thinking, well, maybe there's a chance. Maybe there's some hope for me. Maybe I can't bust a move on the dance floor because I'm dancing in my brain as a psychic. So you kind of you know I don't want to say caught me
And
then, but
and to me, it's just about really raising your awareness to when you're having that experience. So, as an example, when my kids were, I have two stepkids. And so when they were growing up, they would come home and go, wow, I had this really weird coincidence at school. I had this thought that we were going to have a test in math class, and we did. And I would just stop them. I'm like, that's not a coincidence. You had a psychic experience. And so when you come to recognize that if I think this, or if I feel this, or if I get this imagery, or whatever your channel is, you know, and then it happens, that is the psychic experience.
So how do
So
how
I'm
do we
sure. Oh, go ahead.
oh, sorry. How do we delineate between like a coincidence and a psychic experience? Like how does one discern um
If
between,
you have the information pre the situation happening, it's a psychic experience.
okay.
I was going to ask that question as well
Sorry, I
because
So I'm
spoke
going to
for
give
you.
a very mundane example, very mundane. So you get up in the morning and you're getting ready for work, whatever. And this thought crosses your mind, well, maybe I should take a sweater or maybe I should take an umbrella. But you think to yourself, it's a beautiful day and the sun is out. What do I need that stuff for? And so you don't. And then you get to work and the air conditioner is down at 60 degrees, or some storm rolls through, and you sit there and you're like, oh man, I should have brought that sweater, or oh man, I should have brought that umbrella. So you were receiving the information: take a sweater, take an umbrella. Now granted, you didn't listen to yourself, which is okay, but you received it. And so people that I know that I'm working with, it's like, recognize those moments that you're getting information, and whether you act on it or not is less important than recognizing that you got it, that you received it. Because after a certain amount of time, you're going to go, every time I get that little voice in my head, or I see this image, like of a sweater or whatever, it always comes true. And it's always something that's beneficial in my life. So I think I'm going to listen to it this time versus ignore it.
how do you go from um, getting that intuition about needing a sweater to maintaining that intuition so that like maybe that occurred a couple of times and there's something there. How do you build upon that so that you know the next time that you're going to need that sweater or umbrella, or the time after that, or the time after that?
I mean, it becomes trial and error, and it becomes a practice where you just go, okay, I got this, and I can listen to it or I can ignore it. And there are times where I find myself doing some of the weirdest things, because I get this little, insight. And so I just, now I just automatically do it, and then but for even for me, there are still times where I'll get that little insight and it's like, nah, 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 I don't really feel like doing that. Like, you should get the pot holder, because that pot's going to be hot. And you're like, nah, I just put it on the stove, but it's like burning freaking hot. It's like, I mean, I challenge anybody listening, maybe not in this moment, but to just take a moment to kind of look at your own life for those situations where you have this feeling or whatever that you should act in a certain way and you didn't. And I don't want to say you paid the price, but you kind of paid the price.
Interesting. Yeah, like when you're in a car and you don't have your seatbelt on yet, and you get that kind of like sudden, not because you're supposed to have a seatbelt on, but like suddenly you just kind of feel like I should probably get that on. That happened. Well, at least used to happen to me a lot before I made that you know change in my life to always have that seatbelt on after being destroyed by a Mack truck. But um, that would happen to me a lot, and that's, I guess, I don't know, my kind of example of that. But I don't think I'm psychic or anything, so it could just have been that
Well,
fear of.
I mean, fear can play a part in it. Um, my belief is that we all have psychic abilities. We're just not told that we do. Um, and I get this question a lot, that people want to like develop their psychic abilities because they think that they'll know the future, and they can use it to like, and I don't want to say navigate their life, but because they can use it to navigate their life, but to like heal their trauma and look at themselves and get all of these insights. And it is very, very different for me to give somebody a reading versus me being clear enough inside to listen to myself. We're all good at going into denial and not listening to stuff or talking ourselves out of something. I have another story, another good story. So I mean, this was a number of years ago. Well, actually, a lot of years ago, and the Whole Life Expo. So they were a big metaphysical event, and I had gone to the one. I lived in Seattle, so I would go to it there. I had gone to Atlanta to a show there, but big show, big show. And they came to Texas one year and were in Austin, and it was huge. I didn't get out of my chair for 3 days. I mean, there were like 22,000 people there.
Oh,
So they
wow.
were going to, yeah, it was huge. So they were coming back and they were doing the event in Dallas. Now, Austin, geographically speaking, has three major cities that can feed into it, which I was like, that made a lot of sense, where Dallas is kind of, you know, not in this cluster of major cities. And so I don't, my feeling was, well, it's Whole Life Expo. You can stay at home. You don't have to get a hotel room. And in my mind, I am justifying why I should get a booth, a very expensive booth at Whole Life Expo. But there was this part of me that kept going, and I was like, Rita, if you were doing a reading for yourself on whether you should go to it, it's like you're just not feeling it. You're just not feeling it. So ultimately, I didn't go. Then the airplane struck the towers in New York City, and Whole Life Expo in Dallas did not happen because, well, it happened, but none of their speakers showed up because they couldn't fly anybody in.
Wow. That that's serious intuition. That's
But it's
heavy.
really, but it's about listening to yourself. Does this feel good to me? Does this feel right? Or am I talking myself into it? And when we read for ourselves, We are so good at talking ourselves into stuff that we don't want to do, or not doing stuff that we should do.
Yeah. Wow. That's almost hard to follow already. Um, you had said earlier about, some people have that misconception about, like you're just able to sit there and read the future. So one thing that I wanted to ask before you hit us with that
Sorry.
was no, it's good. That's why you're here. That stories like that. That's incredible. Um, how do you deal with those misconceptions, and which misconceptions kind of irk you the most?
Well, I mean, I don't deal with the misconceptions. The narrative that is often put out there is you need to open up your chakras, so you need to like listen to this music to open up your six chakras so you can see. And it's like, yeah, whatever. If I'm going to do anything, I'm going to focus more on what's going on inside of me, which will naturally open up channels, because the focus is inside versus doing these external things with the goal of having something happen, which usually makes it not happen.
Right, right, right.
So what you're really focusing on is not this external mysticism, but really what's kind of indwelled already inside of yourself or somebody else.
Correct. And again, when you're doing a reading for somebody else, it's like, so there's our auric field, which is the electromagnetic field around our body, and then our aura, and then there are our chakras and our energy and whatever. And so we are like a walking billboard of our stuff. But I'm not in your aura. I am external to it, so I can look at it from a very objective place. But when you're in your body, you are in the midst of your programming. You're in the midst of your previous trauma. You are in the midst of societal programming. So you have to sit there and kind of sort through all of your own crap to move that out of the way, to be neutral, to going, okay, this is what I got, and I'm going to act on it. I mean, I think everyone has had this situation where they're in a relationship and on some level they know that like they need to go and it needs to end, but they just, they lie to themselves like, no, it'll be okay, and but you're not really being honest with yourself, and probably if you asked yourself, should I stay in this relationship? The answer you would get is no.
Right. Yeah. I actually, it wasn't like a romantic relationship or anything, but I've recently come out of what I thought was a pretty toxic relationship and friendship with some.
Oh boy.
Won't get super into it, just relating to the subject. And what you're describing is exactly how I felt for the longest time. Where it's like, this is almost suffocating and strangling. Like we're just vampires to each other. We're like, why are we still hanging out and talking the way that we do all the time? And since we kind of parted ways, because all parties involved kind of felt it. Um, there's like a weight has been lifted. Like I stand taller, and
Mhm.
I don't know if it has something to do with something going on with like the aura or the auric, what did you just auric boundary is what you called it,
The auric field.
field
Well,
field.
when you're interacting with someone who, I don't want to say that they're negative, that brings down your energy, and interferes with you being you. And if you find that you are, I like to call it bad brain. If you're running around and you have bad brain, and every time you interact with this person, you go into this negative place, or you feel like you've been, your energy's been sucked out of you, or, whatever, it's kind of like, there's a part of us that's like, why am I doing this? This person not, there's always that little narrative going on inside. but we don't listen to it. And I think if I say anything, that's the part that needs to be listened to, because if it's telling you what the heck are you doing, then maybe you need to listen to that and take a step back and go, what am I doing? Because
Right.
that's spirit or your guides or your higher self or whatever trying to get your attention. And that's a psychic thing. Somebody's talking to you.
And then it just kind of becomes a matter of like, when do you actually start to listen? Um, I'm curious, just because you were mentioning, like you said, like Seattle, and then we're talking about Dallas and all these other places. Is there, in your experience, anywhere that is maybe geographically better for your abilities? Oh, like,
Okay,
for instance,
interesting. No, I know where you're going. So there are
okay,
people, and this isn't my area, but I can like kind of talk on it generically. That do something called astrocartography, and they look at your birth chart, and then they map it on the Earth. And so, based on like the relationship between your planets and different geographic locations, can tell you like, well, this would be a good spot for you, or if you went here, these are the kinds of challenges, or this would be enhanced, whatever. Um, Texas has been a little bit hard. It's a Bible Belt state, but by the time I moved to Texas, I already had kind of a national presence, so it was okay. Um, Washington was the most interesting. I lived in California too, and I'm from New York, so I have a lot of Washington, I think, was the most interesting, because doing psychic work, doing energy healing, anything in that realm was pretty much accepted by the general public. So, Boeing, the aircraft manufacturer, is like the primary employer in the Seattle area. And so Boeing had clubs, like the AV club and the chess club and this club. And one of their clubs was a parapsychology club. And in order to fund the club had psychic fairs twice a year. And the fair went out in the company newsletter, and so it made psychic stuff be okay in the whole Boeing culture, which was most of Seattle. And so I tell people, I came out of the psychic closet in Seattle because there was no shame. There wasn't anything to hide, because if you said, oh yeah, I do psychic readings, it's like, oh yeah, my neighbor is a Reiki master. It's like, because it was just so common in that area.
I've noticed that. I don't even think that's just generalized in with the psychic field either. I think that area, at least in the packs that I've ran with, tends to kind of be that way for a lot of different
Mhm.
things of in the paranormal. Uh,
Alternative thought ideas.
yes,
Exactly.
yeah, that's a way better, more elegant way of saying it. um,
So,
But I
what do
think
you what do
the
you
base of it, because I haven't lived in Seattle in forever, but I think the base of it was it opened the door to being able to talk about things that were at the time very taboo, and have it be okay.
you think that has anything to do with the weather there? Like you guys have like all the rain and the kind of birth grunge music and stuff. Like, is that maybe a geographical thing that?
I don't know.
Um,
I only lasted 4 years, and then I had to go because it was too cold, too wet, and too dark for me. I had to go back to a sunshine state.
So to touch on one of our guests that we just had on, Father Vincent Lampert, if he were on right now, he's very charitable and very kind. But I think his opinion would be not to dabble in this stuff, in the psychic realm and things like that. Now, not a direct answer to him, but let's say somebody that would be Catholic or Christian or Muslim or whatever it might be that kind of sways away from these kind of things. What would you say to these people to invite them in to kind of open their minds and have them take a look at this kind of alternative methods.
I probably wouldn't say anything. No, seriously. Um, but I would open up the conversation to what we were talking about. Well, haven't you had this experience? And how would you identify that? And okay, so I mean, I live in Texas. I have a lot of friends that are Christians, so there's been a lot of conversations that have happened. And so while I might say, psychic, they might say, oh, well, that was the Holy Spirit talking to me, and I don't know.
So it's
I
just maybe
There's a lot
even
of semantics. There's just a lot of semantics that go on, and it's whether they can step above their vocabulary. Because really, if you sit there and talk about, you know, being filled with the Holy Spirit and, speaking tongues or, you know, whatever, having Jesus come talk to you or whatever, it's like, it's the same, except we use different words to talk about the same experience because it is a human experience. And if you can let go of your words and look at the experience of it, then you could maybe own it, but they can't usually. At least that's been my experience.
so just maybe even just like how one allows themselves to interpret what's
Hmm.
happening.
Hmm.
Um, but so I'm glad he brought that episode up because that episode dealt with exorcisms specifically. Um, and I watched a good bit of the videos that you have on your channel on YouTube, which I will link to because I want anyone who listens to this to go check it out because there's just so much interesting stuff on there. But you
Oh,
had a
there's even
series,
more stuff on my webpage.
yeah, yeah. There's like three or four different links that I had open the last couple of days on my browser. I was just trying to absorb as much as possible. But the one thing that like really jumped out was attached entities. And if you're cool talking about that, I wanted to get into that a little bit just because I was fascinated with the videos that you had uploaded, but it also is a good callback to that episode that we had a couple of weeks ago because, um, you know, interpretations being what they are, it could be you could have been dealing with similar things that he may have been dealing with.
Oh, they're the exact same thing, but it's just different words. Um,
Right.
you know, um, so my experience has been, well, let me just kind of back up. So this is my definition of an attached entity. So an attached entity is the presence of, and in the majority of the time, a non-corporeal being, so a human being, dead, invisible human being, that enters our auric field, which is the energy field around our body, and tries to manipulate and control what's going on inside of you. Whether it's like talking to you bad or making you feel bad, but there's always a negative connotation. And I have to caveat that with when things are inside of our auric field, we assume it's us because our auric field is us. And so when they enter the auric field, many times we assume, well, if I'm having these thoughts, they're my thoughts. If I'm having these feelings, they're my feelings. Where if they're outside our auric field, we can make that separation. Um, Many times attached entity, so an attached entity is not a ghost. It doesn't take up residence in a location. So there is, it's connected to a person, it's connected to an individual, and depending on, they have to be invited in. So I have a lot of people that go, oh, well, I went to this cemetery and now I have an entity attachment. I'm like, it doesn't work that way. It's kind of like the black eye children. You have to invite them in. And then they attach to you, and they attach to some negative vibration, negative energy that you're carrying around, your negative thought patterns. And so I've done a lot of spirit release work with people over the years, and a lot. I get a lot of calls from people. It's like, well, I've spent thousands of dollars, and they get rid of the entity, but then it comes back. But the dynamic is they moved the entity out of their auric field, which allowed them to raise their personal vibration, and they're able to hold that personal vibration to a certain state. But then something happens. I'm sorry, my dog is going crazy in
No,
the other
it's
room.
okay. It's good.
But then something happens that triggers them, that lowers their vibration into that same negative triggered pattern that they had before, and the entity comes back because now their defenses are down. And until they raise their vibration again, they're going to have that entity kind of lurking. How's that?
You know what's interesting? What you just said. There's some methodology that's a little bit different, and some hermeneutics and some words that are different, but that's pretty much what Father Lampert said a couple weeks ago. From a different standpoint, obviously, but what you just communicated to us is pretty much what he communicated, just from a different
Well,
basis.
there is a phenomena, and the phenomena is very consistent, and so you could put whatever words you want on it, but it's still the same thing, And I've only had two clients that I would say were full blown, like, possessed people. Okay, one was a client that I referred because she had this nasty entity attached to her that was kind of beyond my skill set. So I have a really good friend who's a demonologist, and I'm like, Mike, I'm sending her to you. And he was just really busy, apparently. So I give her the number, and I don't know, a few weeks later, I was out shopping, my phone rings, I answered the phone, she was like, he didn't call me back. And I'm like, holy crap, because this woman was so afraid and had this very soft voice. She sounded like a grandmother. And the person that I'm like, I'll call Mike and have him get a hold of you. And I hang up and I call Mike and I'm like, her entity just called me. I mean, it was just like creepy,
Wow.
creepy.
That's, yeah, I don't know how I would respond to that kind of phone call.
Should have
Well,
called Father
I mean,
Lampert.
well, it was just kind of like, okay. I mean, I've never had that happen before where the entity actually called me. I mean, usually, a person has an entity attachment and the person makes the appointment and then they cancel because the entity doesn't want them to have the appointment. That's usually what happens. Not that the entity is pissed off. And I'm like, yeah, the entity called.
Do you think that that was the entity? I don't know, posturizing, like almost kind of trying to stir the pot and demonstrate how strong it was, or is maybe did that thing regret attaching and also won out?
No, my feeling was is that entity had climbed all the way into her body. Because a lot of the times the entity just kind of like hangs out in your auric field and they might like stand right behind you or to the side. And I've only had a couple of cases where they actually did a full blown possession. And she was one of them. That entity was in her body and took it over, which is how the
Wow.
entity could call because it
Yeah,
was not her voice
that,
at all.
that just gave me goosebumps. Um, I'm curious.
I
You
have to
said that.
I'm doing my show. I'm doing ghost stories, and I'm doing a conference, and I'm going to be talking ghost stories. But see, that would be a good one.
Yeah, that is a good one. Um, you had said that this could only happen due to invitation. So I'm curious: is there a way to do this by accident? Can you invite something and not realize that you've done it, or do you have to have
That's
complete?
usually what happens. No, that's usually what happens is you accidentally invite it in. So the most common individuals that end up with entity attachments, sorry, I'm making a note about that story, that have entity attachments are little kids, that are brought up in traumatic households because they're asking for someone to come save them, and who comes but the entity. So that's the most common place. And it's also the most challenging individuals to work with to move it out because they grow up with the entity as being part of their lives and they just assume that that's who they are. Um,
Is
Okay,
that is
yeah.
that like their invisible friend kind of thing?
could be, could be, not necessarily, but could be. One of the more common is people that have drug, alcohol, addiction issues, where Frank is a really nice guy till he starts drinking and then he becomes a totally different person. And they're the totally different person because they're the person with the entity that's kind of running the show. And so the addictive behavior is how they open the door to let it in. But then I've had clients that did automatic writing, um, did channeling, and they really didn't know what they were doing, and invited in. And people sit there and go, "Oh, well, if you play with a Ouija board, you're going to end up with all these issues." But
I was going to ask that.
but that's because I was like psychic momenting you. Uh,
You got me. You got me. 100%.
but the reality is that when the people, I'm going to use the automatic writing, they'll do that, but then they become dependent on it, so they're doing automatic writing and they're communicating with some spirit, and the spirit's like giving them all kinds of great information. And now they're asking the spirit for some guidance and they're trusting it, and they've just opened the door and let it in. But then over time, the communication starts to change and they start getting a little snipey, and now they're yelling at you. And so instead of being this bright light, they've manipulated you into becoming this evil thing, which was really who they were in the first place. So it's one thing to play around with a Ouija board, I mean, whatever, it's a non-issue. It's another thing to use it because you're getting information from whoever the spirit is and becoming like dependent. I'm not really sure what other word to use for that, on this communication with the spirit.
Yeah, it's like a codependency almost.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I
Well,
and the automatic writing has seemed to have been the worst. I've had several people that did automatic writing, and they would start off with one entity, and I had one lady that had eight. But
wow,
the
that's
one
heavy.
entity, well, but she started with the one entity that she did invite in, and then that entity brought other people in and created a vortex in her space, and it was very complicated to deal
Yeah,
with.
it sounds complicated.
How would one differentiate between true attachment like that versus maybe just something going on mentally?
So, like a schizophrenic person
Yeah.
having people talk to them? Is that
Yeah,
kind of
I
what
guess
you're saying?
that would make sense. Or any of the other kind of mental health diagnoses that you run into, and I'm sure that there are, on both cases, sometimes misdiagnosis of, this person actually does just have something chemically going on, and this person might actually then have attachments that aren't being addressed because
I mean, usually where you find that is in people that are schizophrenic, that sit there and say, oh, well, I'm talking to people, or these people are talking to me. And it's, and you look at them, it's like, yeah, they sure are. um, I think that some people that might be psychopaths might have some entity issues, where they have these voices telling them to do stuff, but they're not clinically schizophrenic. So when you start getting into like those really bad ones, but those are the only two that really jump into my mind. I mean, the schizophrenia, um, that's a pretty high probability that there is an entity there. You know, because people that have schizophrenia, when you look at them from a psychic perspective, their chakras, their energy centers, which are supposed to open and close, are usually fixed in one position. And so they're not really able to filter information. And so they just receive whatever is there, you know, and that includes things that is normally filtered out by, our cognitive reality.
Okay. Well, that makes sense.
I'm getting the dictionary out. Hold on. Cognitive reality.
It is the
uh,
reality that we all agree upon, because most of reality says that there's no such thing as ghosts. And most of reality says there's no such thing as psychic abilities. Or I just went and did an investigation, and there was this kind of what looked like it had been kind of this swampy area. And I'm not like a big, like, oh my God, there's elementals in my backyard. But I'll tell you what, there were elementals on that property, you know. But
So what are elementals?
I don't know, like fairies and,
Okay.
those kind of
Yep.
things. Um, I mean, but it had that energy. It had, and I wasn't really pursuing that because we were looking for the angry drunk man. So,
I know where to find him.
he's actually right there, and he's talking to you.
but
But you brought up ghost hunting, and I'm actually really fascinated with how that would work with somebody who is as connected with the ability as you are, because you're running a paranormal podcast and everything. Obviously, like I've kind of grew up being a fan of this stuff and interested in it, and I mean, you can go all the way back to when Taps first showed up on the Sci-Fi Channel. I watch all of this stuff. I read all of the books, and it tends to be normal people who aren't channeling any type of ability with now it's spirit boxes and some of the other equipment, but it used to be cameras or whatever, but there are the people with the abilities like yourself or the Warrens. How does that feel to walk into a haunted environment being that connected with what's going on?
well, depending on where I go, will depend on like my puke factor. Um,
So it
So,
could be pretty
so
intense.
one of the things that I love about my role is I don't have to buy any equipment. I don't have to review any footage. I don't have to do anything. I just have to show up. So that's like, yay. And when I go into an investigation, it's like you guys go over there and talk about it, and I'm going to go over here. And when you guys are done talking, then I'm going to walk in because basically all I want to know is we're at a location. And if we're at a location, it's there's something going on, or at least according to the owners, there's something going on. And I'll just walk through and I'll sit down and I'll scan the room or scan the property, look at the owners because sometimes they're the issues. Um, and then, sometimes I'll walk through with the group and go, I'm just noticing something here, maybe set up a piece of equipment. So when I was doing my most active ghost hunting, it was before taps. I mean, so and there really wasn't any equipment other than cameras and video and that kind of thing. So I would be like, do some stuff over here and whatever, and then I'll make my communication or review to the owner of the property as to this is what I noticed and this is what I felt, and kind of trip them out a little bit. But I think a lot of people don't realize is like everybody wants their stuff to be really haunted, but there's so many places that it's a residual haunting, which means there's not an active spirit there. It's just leftover energy. Or, there's just a bunch of stagnant energy and, it's just stuck. So it feels really heavy, and so you get these sensations from it, but there's not anything going on.
Is there anything you could do in that situation to help with that stagnated energy or the residual
Yeah, I
stuff?
tell them that they should clean their house usually.
Is it that simple?
Sorry, were you drinking?
I'm good. Wasn't expecting it, but I'm good.
I don't understand why things aren't flying off my walls right now. If it's that,
Yeah, I got some problems here.
um, I can understand the residual energy part, but usually, like stagnant energy, you go into an antique store, and that stuff's been sitting on the shelves for months and months and months and hasn't been moved. And, there's just that feeling, that the energy is just very stagnant, and there's some like very disappointed people because you're like, well, there's really not anything active going on here. And they're like, what do you mean? Whatever.
yeah, it does kind of always seem to be like people that the hardest, most difficult thing that they would have to face is what they want to face at that point. Like to me, I think getting that news would be fantastic. I mean, okay, well now I don't have to, rid my house of this entity or fear that we're being attached by something. That is something that you see like a lot, even on the television shows. Which I mean, take for a grain of salt. Everything's so overproduced at this point, but that is a narrative that like everybody wants to be haunted for some reason.
I
I
don't.
think.
So on Thursday nights I do a Dr. Rita Live. Well, it's Thursday Night Live with Dr. Rita Louise, available on Facebook and YouTube. And so inevitably someone will ask me about some dead person, and so like on my little blurpy thing, it's like, please no questions about dead people, because I won't respond to them. And I always, I can always feel they're looking at me like, not that I can see them, like, well, what do you mean? You're a psychic. You should talk to dead people. And it's like, I don't want to talk to dead people. It's like, because if I'm talking to your dead people, that means I have to take your Aunt Sally and have her come to me so I can communicate with her. And I don't want her in my house. It's one thing if I go to your house and I'm talking to Aunt Sally, but she can freaking stay there. I don't want her in my house. And they
I don't
just,
even want my live ants in my house.
huh?
I said I don't even want my living ants in my house.
Yeah, that.
Man, I had a follow up, and it's completely out of my brain now.
I disrupted the whole thing. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. So, is there something you have to do to prevent Aunt Sally from attaching to you when you are there, and then following you home?
I mean, I don't personally do anything, if I feel like I have stuff on me, I just kind of like shoo it off. I've had stuff follow me home, but it'll like hang out for a couple of days and then it just goes. But the amount of locations that actually have an active haunting versus just a residual haunting um, is like, 90-10. I mean, there's not all that many very active hauntings. I've only experienced a handful of them myself. A lot of residual, but not really active.
Yeah, and I think that's a statistic people should be happy to hear because, again, you're not dealing with any of the severe craziness that comes with it.
Hmm.
Um, I don't, with this much time that we've been talking, I don't want to jump around topic, 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 and then, take up too much of your time. But I wanted to ask a couple of questions. Um, do you do tarot readings or have you ever done tarot?
I
And
used
basically,
to.
the reason I asked that is because I had an interest in it. I have a deck. I don't really use them, but I was curious if there is any like kind of truth to um, that despite being just like what you talked about the Ouija board earlier, and a lot of people would say, well, that's a Mattel board game, and discredit it. But despite that, this is like a deck of cards that I bought. Is there an energy to it? Should these be treated with respect? I have it in a box. I have a nice a velvet bag that I put them in. I keep them nice. I don't touch them, but I know they're there. Is there like something to that? I guess is what I'm asking.
So I have some cards that I keep in their box. I have some that I have in a nice box that are wrapped in a silk scarf. And then I have two decks of the same cards that I read this deck called Dream Cards, and they're an oracle deck. They're not a tarot deck. And so one is in my suitcase for when I go to shows and I have a table and I'm set up. And then I have one that's up in my desk. But like when I'm working with clients, I don't ever use the cards. I only use them when I'm at an event because I can crack out a 15-minute reading, just a cold bam reading. And mine live in a Ziploc bag, a really old Ziploc bag that's in this suitcase that lives in my closet. So,
So I
but
don't.
dealing with cards are different than the Ouija board because the Ouija board, you are asking. You know what I mean? You're asking for information where the tarot cards, you might ask a question, but the tarot cards are telling a story. So it's a
Right.
different level of involvement with the spirit world, if that made sense.
No, it does, and I'm glad you clarified those. So basically, I guess I don't have to worry or be concerned that the corner of the box got a little dented in a move once, and
No.
like I didn't create like some type of terrible energy uh, from doing that.
I
Um,
guess I'm one of the most like not dogmatic people when it comes to different things, So there's a lot of stuff that's out there and they're like, oh, well, you need to do this. I used to read at this one like smaller psychic fair, and this one guy had to face east because if he didn't face east, it was wrong. Well, the room didn't face east, so he would always be like perpendicular to everybody else, but that was his thing, and it was like, you know, I'm just not that way.
that's no, that's cool to hear because no, you're coming from a pretty you know expert opinion. So, I take what you say with a lot of credence.
Thank you.
And again, I don't mean to, well, absolutely welcome. I don't mean to jump around here, but, we try not to take too much of your time. But you had a video of, uh, well, discussing Nephilims.
Hmm.
And basically, our show's called Sasquatchers. That's a play on Sasquatch. We don't have nearly enough Sasquatch content. Um, I wanted to get your opinion because there's now a growing number of people with the theory that Sasquatch is actually a Nephilim. And since you have some knowledge of it, I just wanted to get your take on it real quick.
And I would say no. Not at all. I mean, the Nephilim is without going. I mean, because it's getting late. Without going into this whole thing. But it comes from the Greek and it means giant or earthborn. And so there are stories of giants that walk the earth, that you find in cultures around the world. And so that's what that word means is earthborn, And so when you read stories from myth about the giants being born of or being created from the cast off blood of Uranus, or there was another god who threw knives into the earth and they became the giants, but they were the earthborn. Um, but not Sasquatches. And the
Okay.
giants were eliminated in the flood. I mean, that was one of the major things that the
Mm.
flood did was to get rid of them because
Right.
they didn't
It's just one of
obey.
those. Yeah.
We're called Sasquatchers, but we've only talked about Sasquatch one time.
It's just one of those things,
Twice now.
I just, for me, as much like Sasquatch to me has kind of become like the Jesus fish of the paranormal. Like
Uh huh.
it's almost a mascot, and you see it everywhere now. And I'm here for it, but I think a lot of the theories that have popped up over the last however many years uh, almost are grasping for straws a little bit. So since you had that knowledge, I just wanted to ask real quick because you're blunt with your answering, which I
Yeah, I
love.
help that.
It's a good quality. I prefer that over being talked around for 15 minutes just to get to like no, and here's why.
Non-answer, a non-answer. Here, but it was a lot of
So
fluff. Here, we gave you a lot of fluff, but said nothing. It's like, okay, thanks. But buy my book. I'll tell you
right.
all about
Well, on that note, I hope all of our listeners and future listeners do buy your books. Um, we'll include all of your links and stuff. But is there anything you want to promote verbally in the meantime?
So if anybody would like to schedule a private consultation with me, they can go to my website, which is soulhealer.com, and just drop me a note. And I would love to invite your listeners every Thursday night, 7 o'clock Central. I do Thursday Night Live with Dr. Rita Louise. So you can uh, go to my group page, Dr. Rita Live on Facebook. You can go to Just Energy Radio. That was my old podcast, Just Energy Radio on YouTube, and access it there. And I just set up Rumble, but I haven't. This will be my first week to see if it actually worked, or else I'd give that more of a pitch. But people can come. So this week I'm talking about ghost stories. I have a topic that I talk about for about 15 minutes, and then I open up the chat and people can ask questions about pretty much anything except dead people. So, yeah.
What about almost dead people?
Well, every so often a dead person will come through, and what's interesting is if you ask me about a ghost at your house or if you ask me about your attached entity, I'll talk to you about it. But if you ask me about dead Aunt Sally, I'm not going there. But every so often, dead Aunt
Well,
Sally turns up in a reading, so can't help
Aunt Sally's not dead yet, but Thanksgiving hasn't happened, so I'll talk to you after that.
it. Okay.
All right. Dr. Rita Louise, everybody. Again, I want to go ahead and thank you for your time. It was an awesome conversation, and maybe we can do it again sometime.
Okay. That sounds great.
All
Thanks,
Thank
right.
you so
guys.
thank you so
Bye,
much.
everybody.
Yep. Yep. We always sign off with a saying, so I'm sorry if we look silly with it, but all right, everybody. Thanks for squatching.
Sasquatch you later. Cringe.